Hello there, thanks for joining me. In this video, we'll take a look at the toolbar here in Corel Painter. The first option is the brush tool, and the brush tool needs to be active for you to be able to use a brush or paint on your canvas. So now that I have the brush tool selected, I can choose a brush up here in the brush selector. I can pick any one of these brush categories, and each category has a bunch of different pens. Let's go with this scratchboard tool that I have, and if I draw with my pen onto my tablet, I can get some brush strokes. And you can do the same thing with a mouse. If you click with your mouse and drag, you can paint, but you don't get the pressure sensitivity that you get with a pen here. There's a bunch of different settings here for the brush tool. We can draw freehand strokes like this, or if we turn on straight line strokes, then we make a point and make another point and it draws a line in between. I don't find this to be particularly useful, so I usually draw freehand strokes. If for any reason you're drawing like that and it's all crazy, that's probably why it's happening. You need to turn on freehand strokes. Align to path will let you paint onto a path, but that's something a little more advanced that we're not really going to get into. The brush size can be changed manually here with this slider, so you can get a small brush or you can get a large brush. The opacity controls how much you can see through your brush stroke. So right now my brush stroke is fully opaque, but if I were to make it less opaque, more transparent, let's say 10% of what it was, then now when I go to paint, I'm making these opaque or semi-opaque brush strokes, so you can see through the brush strokes. For this particular brush, I like to leave it at 100, so I'm going to put it back there. This is how I like it to work, but some of your other brushes, you might want them to be a little bit transparent. Resaturation and bleed kind of control how the paint affects other paint that's on the canvas and whether or not it's going to change the color of it or smudge it. This is some stuff that I get to in videos that are more about the brushes, so I'm not going to get too into detail about this right now. All these settings will change depending on what kind of brush you pick. So you might have more or less of these settings here. The next thing we'll look at is the dropper tool. The dropper will let you sample or pick up any color that's on screen if you tap on it. So right now I have this red. If I tap over here, if you look in my color picker here, I get this blue, and if I put any other kind of color on the screen, I can get that too. So let's just put some different colors down and we'll see that if we use the dropper tool, we can get any one of these colors just by tapping on them. So this is a good way to keep your color consistent, because then you can just keep picking colors from your canvas rather than having to make a mixer pad or anything. The shortcut for this is Alt on your keyboard. You just hold down Alt and then tap, and you can get this dropper at any time. You don't have to go over here and select it over from the toolbar. The next tool we'll look at is the paint bucket. The paint bucket will allow you to fill large areas of your canvas really quickly. So I'm just going to delete some of these examples here. Go to a fresh layer, and I'm just going to draw something here on this layer. I'm going to draw a circle. Well, let's say we wanted to fill that circle. You can use the paint bucket to do that. You want to make sure your paint bucket's set to current color. It's probably going to be set to source image, and that's not going to help you much right now. So change that to current color, and then we can pick a color here. Let's try this red, and we'll tap with the paint bucket inside of this black circle, and you can see that it'll fill it for us all the way to the edge. Now it might not always get it perfect. There might be some little bit of white space in between. That might happen, but might not be noticeable if you look at it from far away, so you might have to watch out for that. You can also just use this tool to just fill your background if you really quickly want to just make a sky color for your background. There you go, now you've got your whole canvas filled. You don't have to paint it all in. So I'll start with this paint bucket more often than not when I want to just kind of fill my canvas really quickly. This tolerance setting determines how closely it will bleed to the edge when you're filling shapes. The feathering will feather the edge a little bit. You probably don't really want to mess with these two settings very much, especially if you're just going to use it to fill the canvas. Anti-alias is a good thing to leave on. It should be on by default, and you'll know that something's on because it's blue. If you're having trouble with the paint bucket, make sure fill cell is selected, because fill image will always fill your canvas no matter what. And if you want to be filling inside of shapes, you have to have fill cell selected. If you want to reset any of these tools to their default settings, you can always click this reset tool. It's most often over here to the left of each tool, and it'll just reset the tool to its standard functions and settings. The next tool we'll look at is the eraser, and this is pretty obvious. It just works like the brush tool does, except it removes pixels rather than add them. So I'm erasing some of this blue that is on a layer here. If we move this layer around, you can see I'm just erasing through, and you can see what's on the other side. We can change the hardness of the eraser. Right now it's set to soft, so these edges are soft, but if we set it to hard, we'll get something like this. So depending on how you want to erase, you might want to change these two settings. Again, you can change the size, the diameter of the brush, and you can change the opacity. So you might want to reduce the opacity a little bit if you want to get a more painterly artistic effect and erase more slowly. Generally, I don't use the eraser a whole lot. I might use it to clean up little small areas, but for the most part, if I want to get rid of some pixels, I have a lot of other ways to do it. And you can watch one of my videos on subtractive painting to learn more about that. We'll move on to the next tool, which is the layer adjuster. The layer adjuster is basically just an arrow tool that will let you select individual layers or individual pieces of artwork and move them around. It'll move the entire contents of a layer. So right now what's on this layer is this blue area that I erased 2 holes in, and if I drag it with my pen using the layer adjuster, I can move it around anywhere I want on the canvas to reposition it. If I make another layer and I put something on that layer, like this red dot here, I go back to the layer adjuster, I can now move this red dot. Now if I want to move the blue background, I have to go back to this blue background layer to move that. If I want to move the red dot, even if I'm trying to drag on it and move it, it's not going to go anywhere because the layer I have selected is the background layer. If I want to move this dot, I have to go to the layer that the dot is on and then move it. You can turn on this auto select layer on and off, but that might get a little confusing. You can see if you tap on the layer that you want, you'll get that layer and move it, and if I tap on the dot, then I'll get that layer. But if you have a lot of overlapping layers or a lot of layers that fill the whole canvas, this isn't going to work. So I'll go ahead and just leave it off. I always leave this off. You can also change the layer order. We could move this dot backwards or further down in the layers palette by clicking this button here, and you can see now it's moved behind the blue. I prefer to just move my layers around in the layers palette here though. Now if we tap and we hold on this arrow tool here, we'll get a second option, and that is a shortcut for the free transform tool. And this is a quick way to get to the free transform tool. If we want to transform something, let's put something on our canvas here that we can transform. We'll make a really quick sphere, and we'll go to the free transform tool, and by default it sets it to move, but we can try some different things like scale. We'll tap on scale. You can see that that will let us make this bigger or smaller and squash it and stretch it. Each time you make a change, you have to commit to it or apply it by clicking this check box here. Let's try another transformation. Let's try a perspective distortion. So now we can make it look like it's going off into perspective. Now this might kind of make these edges a little weird on some of these shapes. You have to watch out for this, but it's pretty cool. You can always go through and clean up that edge if you need to. The next tool we'll look at is the rectangular selection tool. And the rectangular selection tool will allow us to make a selection in a rectangle shape. So if we wanted to make a square, for instance, we could hold Shift on our keyboard to constrain the selection to a perfect square, or if we don't hold shift, then we can make any kind of rectangle. We'll do a square here. And this selection is kind of a, you can think of it like a stencil. It's going to make sure that if you put anything, any paint down or anything, it's only going to go inside of this area. So if I use my brush tool and I start painting, you can see that even if I try to paint outside the square, I can't. So these selections can be very helpful. You can use them in a lot of different ways. You could also use my paint bucket just to fill this selection. So this is a good quick way to get squares in different shapes. If you want to make multiple selections, you hold shift and your cursor will turn into this little plus icon here. You can make multiple selections at a time. If you want to subtract from a selection, you hold down Alt on your keyboard and you can select, or you can subtract from selections and make some pretty complex shapes. Then again, you could go and you could fill it in with the paint bucket. If you want to deselect a selection to get rid of it, you can do CTRL+D. We'll look at the elliptical selection tool, or the oval selection. This lets you make ovals and circles. If you hold shift, you can constrain it to a perfect circle. Same as with the rectangular selection tool, you can go through and fill it in. If you want to hide a selection temporarily, just to make it so that you can't see it, you can do CTRL+SHIFT+H on your keyboard. So the selection is still active, but I can't see it. And sometimes I find those edges are distracting, so I like to hide them. You have to watch out for this, because if you leave this selected and you forget about it with the selection hidden, you might be trying to paint outside of the shape and not be able to. And the reason why is because the selection is still active. So you have to do a CTRL+D to deselect, or you can do a select none from the select menu. That'll make sure that nothing is selected. We'll move on to the next tool, which is the lasso selection. Now, the lasso just kind of lets you draw a freeform selection. So if I wanted to make a shape like this, or make a selection like that of multiple objects or something, I can draw a little area, and then of course I could fill it in if I want to. There is a polygonal lasso tool. If you tap and you hold on this, you get a second option here. That'll let us make a selection by defining individual points. So you can make a polygon selection. You double tap really fast to close the selection. I find this tool can be a little tricky sometimes. It doesn't always work for me, especially if I make a really big, really complex selections, and so I'm gonna have to watch out for that. The next tool is the magic wand. And what the magic wand will do is it will let us select very specific areas of things. So I'm going to draw some artwork here. Let's just draw a weird little shape. And let's say we wanted to select just this black area that I put down here. The easiest way to do that is to use the magic wand. So with the magic wand selected, we can tap on several different areas. We can tap here on the black to make a selection of this black if we wanted to. We could also tap inside of the shape to select the inside of the shape if we wanted to, for some reason, fill that. We could do that like this. And now we have a copy of that shape that we could use for whatever reason. We could also use the magic wand to click outside of this shape, and we could get a selection out here. We could fill that. We have a selection like that. So there's a lot of different ways you can use this tool if you want to select certain colors. It gets a little bit trickier when you deal with color gradients or blended color. So if we look at something like this, if I blend this up now and then we try to use the magic wand, it's only looking for that specific gray. So you can change this tolerance level and make it higher or lower and see if you get better results. That might get more of it. We can try that setting and see what we get, but when you start getting into these faded colors, it really doesn't work too well. So it works pretty good for selecting large, solid blocks of color. I usually just leave it at 32. And it works like the other selection tools. If you want to add to selections and subtract, you can do that as well. Now the next thing that we'll look at is the selection adjuster. So I'll make a weird selection shape here. If I want to adjust it, we can use the selection adjuster, and that will let us do some different things to this selection, like change the shape of it. The next thing we'll look at is the crop tool. The crop tool will basically let you trim your canvas, so you can imagine it being like scissors. If you wanted to cut off some of the edge of your canvas and crop it down and make it smaller, you can do it with the crop tool. You have to kind of be careful about that though, because you're kind of freehand drawing this crop, so it's not going to be a specific cut. You would want to try to keep your cropping at a specific size. Like if we had this 11 by 14 canvas here and we wanted to make it an 8 by 10, we'd want to make sure that we crop it at 8 by 10. So this width line would have to be 10 inches exactly, and if you're drawing it by eye, you're not going to have any idea what's 10 inches. You could put the ruler on and you could try to do it that way, but it's probably not going to be very good. So there's probably better ways to crop your artwork, and that would be like using Photoshop. But this will work too if you just want to try to get it pretty close and do it by eye. That'll work too. Next thing we'll look at is the pen tool. The pen tool will let you draw vector art, very simple vector art in Corel Painter. This is a Bezier pen, so I find it's really kind of a difficult thing to use, but it's worth checking out. What you do is you tap and you make a point, and you tap and you make another point, but you hold if you want to make a curve. So I'm holding, I'm not letting go after I tap that first time. You'll get these little handles that let you make some curve shapes. Now, it would take a whole tutorial to go into how to even use this tool and what vector art is and all that stuff, and I'm not going to do that here. But I'm just going to kind of show you what this tool is if you're curious and wondering how it works and what it's useful for. What it will do is it'll allow you to draw vectors, which are very smooth shapes that you can manipulate. So if I wanted to maybe move this shape around and resculpt it, I can do that. So you may have some artwork that requires you to do something like that. And if we tap and we hold on the pen tool, we get another option, which is this freeform. We can basically just try to draw a freeform vector shape, but I find that it doesn't really work very well. The shape's just kind of too messy. So I prefer to do my vector drawing in a vector program like InkScape, which is a free vector program, or you could use Adobe Illustrator. There's a lot of options here for if you do end up making shapes, you can put a line around it, which is called a stroke, or you can fill it with different colors. I'm not really going to go into too much detail about shapes here. Just kind of want to go through these tools one by one. So we'll move on to the next one, which is the rectangular shape tool. It will let you draw shapes that you can fill. If we want to put a stroke color on it of yellow, we can do that. What I'll do is I'll double tap on the icon here for the shape and the layers palette. That gives us some options. We can do some different things to it, like we can fill it with green if we want to, and double tap on that to put a purple stroke on it. We've got some different settings here. We need to do toggle fill color, I suppose, to get that to work. There we go. Then if we wanted to edit that shape, we can do that with the shape selection tool. I'm not going to jump too far ahead, but I just want to show you what this shape is and how it differs from the selection tool. If we were to make a selection, we wouldn't have had these corner points to be able to move. So that's why a shape could be beneficial to you. Same thing with the oval. One of the problems with this tool is that, unlike the selection tool, you can't hold shift to constrain it to a perfect circle, so you have to draw these circles kind of by eye. Same thing with the squares. They might not be absolutely perfect. That's a little tricky. It's too bad that shift doesn't work for these. We'll move on to the text tool. Text is also something that I really don't like to work with in Painter because you can make text, but I wouldn't recommend it because it doesn't really work as well as a program like Photoshop or GIMP for making text. GIMP is a free program that's like Photoshop. You can, if you want, draw text. You can see I get some text here, and if I want I can scale it up and down and move it around quite easily using the layer adjuster tool. I could also transform it using the free transform tool. If I wanted to rotate it, for instance, I could do that. But again, this isn't the best way to work with text because as you'll see, if I go to try to edit this text now, since I transformed it, it became an image. It's no longer editable text, so that wouldn't be an issue in Photoshop. We could still go in here and change this text and retype it if we wanted to. This is how you change your font. If you want a different font, I find that Painter doesn't handle a lot of fonts very well, and I've got a lot of fonts. You can change your font size and all these other settings if you want, and the font color. But again, I don't really work with text much in here because it's kind of a hassle. We'll move on to the shape selection tool. As I showed you before, you can make a shape, and then if you want to edit some of the corners, you can use the shape selection tool, and you can tap and drag to make a selection of the point that you want, or you can try to click on the point and drag it around. You can move the handles of the point to change the curve. And you can make some pretty complex shapes. If we tap and we hold, we get the scissors tool. That'll let us cut one of these paths if we wanted to break it apart and move it a different way. We can also add points and remove points. We need to have our selection active here to do that. So I can tap on here and add a point. Let's see if we can get it to work. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this really isn't the best program for vector art. It's kind of clunky. Well, the add didn't work, but the subtract is working. So you can see we can remove points. We can convert points from corners to sharp points. So we remove the handles basically by using that there. Or we can add handles. So you tap and you drag and then you redefine the handles. The next tool that we will look at is the cloner. Cloner will let you put up a photograph or an image and paint over it and get the colors from the photograph in your painting. So I'll show you what cloning is. I'm going to open a recent photograph here of this panorama that I took a few years back. And if I wanted to clone this and do a painting of this with the exact colors and their exact positions, I can do that by making a clone of it. So what you want to do is go to the File menu, and then we'll go to Quick Clone. That will open a clone of our photograph as a new painting. So this is a new separate canvas that we can paint on. And you'll see that it's a little bit dim because there's a tracing paper over it. So this allows you to see your photo while you're painting on it and cloning. And if we use a cloner and we start painting, we'll get the colors that are underneath. And I can turn this this tracing paper on and off by doing Control-T on my keyboard. And you can see if we were to print this artwork, this is what it would look like printed. So this hitting Control-T again, what this is doing is it's just kind of letting me see my photo while I'm painting on it. So you can see I'm getting this painting now that looks like paint, but it's all of the colors from the artwork. Or from all of the colors from the photograph, I mean. So you can see how you can make some pretty cool stuff with this, but I'm not learning anything about how to paint trees or how to paint landscapes or how to use perspective or how to draw reflections or how to change my color or how to pick color or anything really. I'm not really learning anything. All I'm really doing is doing what a computer would do and just moving my hand over sections of this painting that are similar and attempting to make it look like a painting. And you know, that's fine. It's gonna look like a painting, but think about how much cooler it would be if you made this painting from your imagination and you painted your own world with your own colors. I think you would learn a lot more and you'd feel a lot better about the painting rather than just tracing over something. So that's my take on cloning, but it's definitely a cool thing to try out, especially if you're a beginner, and you can make some pretty cool stuff with it without it looking too cloned if you're pretty good at it. So that's cloning. I'm gonna just close this and we'll move on. Underneath this menu here for the cloner, there's also a stamp cloner. So if we wanted to copy certain segments of something, let's say for instance, I draw something here and I want to make a copy of it. You can do that with a cloner. Now this isn't the best way to make a copy of something. This is just a tool you can use. You would probably want to use something like this if you were trying to do some photo editing to an image, maybe remove parts of an image or something. But I would typically do this with Photoshop and not with Painter because it's not very easy to do in Painter. What you do is you hold Alt and that'll give you this target, and this will define where you want to clone from. So what it's going to do is, even if I'm painting over here, if my target is here, it's going to paint whatever is around here over here. So it's kind of like a transporter kind of. So I'm going to tap here with Alt to define my point, and I'm going to paint over here. And you can see that cursor on the left is mirroring my cursor on the right. And as long as I don't lift my pen up, it's going to keep painting there. Now if I lift my pen up again and I start painting, it's going to move to a different spot. See how it kind of follows it? So you have to watch out for that. If you want to set your target point again, you can do that. We could set our target up here and we could start painting, and again we get another copy from that location. We'll move on to the next tool, which is Dodge. There's also Burn. Dodge and Burn are just some kind of automatic brushes to lighten and darken. So Dodge is a technical kind of photographic term for if you wanted to lighten an area of a photograph. And let's open a recent photo here of my face, and let's dodge and burn some of it. You would typically use this for photographs and not really for artwork, but you could use it for artwork too. So let's say I want to make my hair lighter. I'll use the dodge tool, and wherever I paint with the dodge tool, it's going to make it lighter. Now this tool is not super great in Painter. It's better in Photoshop, I find. So if you can do this in Photoshop, do that. But if not, then Painter works too. We'll try the burn. That'll let us darken. So if I want to darken my eyes here, it's going to make whatever's already dark darker. Take a look at mirror painting. That'll be next on our list. Mirror painting enables you to paint symmetrically. So I'll do a painting here if we wanted to do like a ornamental pattern or something. We can paint with symmetry. If you want to turn this feature on and off, you have to select the mirror painting tool, and then you have to go here, toggle mirror painting on or off. So if you don't want to paint with mirror painting anymore, you have to turn it off. Now I can just paint normally. Underneath the mirror painting tool, if you hold down, you can get the kaleidoscope mode, which will let us do mirror painting with several different iterations here. So if I paint in this corner, it's going to mirror what I paint in all the other corners. You can change the number of corners with the kaleidoscope tool selected. We can change it higher to up to 12. We can also rotate it if we wanted to. And if we paint, you can see we get this pretty cool mirroring effect. And this is pretty fun to use. And again, if you want to turn it on and off, you just click this little on-off switch here, and then it goes away, and then you can just paint normally. The next thing we'll look at is divine proportion. I have a video specifically on composition that you can look at if you want to learn how you use this tool, but I'll just kind of show you how to turn it on. What this does is this lets you use a proportion ratio that a lot of the old master painters used, and this is based kind of on math and the golden ratio. So what it boils down to is it just lets you have these guides that you can use to decide where to place elements in your artwork. Like if you were going to do a person's face, you would want it to be in a very specific place. So this green line kind of represents the flow of the eye through the artwork towards the focal point, and then the focal point ends up being kind of right here. You can rotate this grid around and move it and do all kinds of stuff to it if you want. Underneath the menu for that, there is also the grid tool. You turn the grid on and off with the eyeball here. This grid works the same way. It lets us use the rule of thirds to plot out our artwork. So if we were doing a portrait of a person, you would probably want their head to be here and their body to be there and so on. And if there was some other focal point in the background like a tree, it would be better here, and the cloud there, and so on. So this is just kind of a, again, one of those things that I go over in the composition video, and then you can learn why to do that. But it's a very good tool to use. Finally, within this category here of guides and grids, there's the perspective grid, and we can turn that on with the eyeball. Now this thing, I've never been able to get it to work. I've tried to use it for several years now. I understand what it's trying to do. It's trying to give me a bunch of guides that go off to a point in perspective, and that's supposed to help me somehow to do a drawing. But when I draw my own perspective guides, I only need but a few. I don't need 500,000 little tiles and grids. And I know there's probably some way to change this. You can change the spacing, bigger and smaller and all that. And, you know, I'm sure with a lot of practice I could find a way to use this, but I prefer to just draw grids in a different, or I prefer to draw perspective lines in a different way rather than use this tool. So we'll look at the grabber tool next. It's this little hand here. The grabber lets you tap and hold and reposition your canvas. So if you find that you've been working on your canvas here and you're zoomed in and you constantly have to try to use your little scroll bars here to move around, you don't need to do that. You can use the hand tool to move your canvas around. Now you can get this hand tool anytime you want just by holding space on your keyboard, so you don't even have to select it here. Just hold space anytime and you'll get the hand tool. So I'm constantly using the space bar. My hand is always on my keyboard. I use that shortcut, and I use tab a lot also. Tab makes your palettes go away temporarily, so that makes it so that you can see more of your screen. So those are the two most often used shortcuts for me. We'll look at the magnifier. That lets you zoom in and out. If you tap with the plus icon, you'll zoom in. If you want to zoom out, you have to hold down Alt on your keyboard to get the minus icon, and you'll zoom out. You can also go to 100% to zoom into 100%. You can go to fit screen to make it fit to your screen. You can go to center image if you wanted to center the image on the screen. So these are kind of helpful if you get some point and you're all zoomed in and you don't know where you're at because you're 1600% zoomed in. Just click fit screen there and it'll put it all back. You can also select an area by drawing a box. I'm tapping and holding, so if I want to zoom into this area here specifically, I can do that. Or if I want to zoom into here, I can do that. We'll look at the rotate page tool. With that selected, we can tap and drag to rotate our page. That can be helpful. I don't use this a lot really, but occasionally it's come in handy. If you want to reset the page, just double tap and it goes back to normal. Down here at the bottom we have this main color and this additional color. There are some instances where you can paint with multiple colors, or you can use this additional color to get some different effects. Typically I don't really mess with this. This little toggle button will switch your main color with your background color. So you probably most of the time want your additional color to be white, and your main color can be whatever. You'll notice that if you click on these you go back and forth, so make sure that you're not on this back one because you might get some trouble painting. Just make sure this foreground color is the one that's usually selected by tapping on it. Down here at the bottom we have a little shortcut to your paper panels. I keep my paper panels open here in a separate panel found under the window paper panels because I use the paper panels often and I want them to be visible. Finally, the last little button here is full screen mode. If we tap this, we will go full screen, or we will go into a window. Now I have my window maximized full screen, but if I were to put it into a window here, just in a floating window, then this full screen button will do a little bit more. You can see it goes back and forth between full screen and the window mode. But I always just keep mine full screen automatically because I like it that way. So I hope that was helpful for you and helped you understand the toolbar here. I'll go into more detail about each of these tools in my other videos where I show you how to create paintings using these tools. If you found this information helpful, take a quick second to like this video and share it on YouTube and on Facebook, and that'll make it easier for other artists out there to find this information. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for my next video.